Alright, I found this VHS tape in the sewer, so we're just gonna play it and see what's on it.
Glad I watched that.
Resident Evil 2 is amazing. It's a near masterpiece of level design, and it's completely redefined what a video game remake should be. But before we start getting into all the great things about the game's design, it would probably make sense to do a little bit of a mini review / history of the original game. If you ask a fan of the Resident Evil series, or a fan of horror games in general, what the best title in the Resident Evil series is, there's a very good chance they will say Resident Evil 2, and for good reason. Resident Evil 2 is the purest expression of what a Resident Evil game is, and I'm using big air quotes here, supposed to be. It's got the tank controls, it's got the puzzles, it's got the zombies, it's got the resource management, and it's got the big monster boss fights. Resident Evil 2 is also very well polished for a game from 1998 and has aged surprisingly well. There are a couple awkward issues with the control scheme, and you're probably going to want to turn on auto-aim to make shooting a gun feel more like shooting a gun and less like shooting a gun but while wearing mittens. But other than that, the game still feels fine to play. Even the cutscenes actually look pretty good, all things considered. Resident Evil 2 also included a ranking system and a couple hidden game modes to massively increase replayability, which is something even modern games struggle with accomplishing today. That being said, there are some issues with the original. The areas where you play as Sherry are hot garbage, the level design breaks down quite a bit the farther you get into the game, and most of the boss fights are basically just smash R2 until thing go away. But the good vastly outweighs the bad. Overall, if I was going to recommend you play 5 games to understand the evolution of the horror genre over time, they would be Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil 4, and Amnesia. Okay, so I guess that's 6, but this is why I'm making YouTube videos and not teaching math. And if you're screaming at your monitor that Resident Evil 4 isn't a horror game, I know, and that's the point. That being said, the fact that Resident Evil 2, as well as 2 other Resident Evil games are on that list, should tip you off to how important and influential the series eventually came to be. If you're legitimately interested in video games as a medium or the history of gaming and you've never played the original Resident Evil 2, I would definitely recommend it if you can figure out some way of getting your hands on it. I would also like to take this time to point out that since emulators and ROMs are of dubious legal standing, I cannot suggest that anyone should easily find and download them off the internet. Now that we have a general idea of how the original game was, let's shelf that for a minute and move on to the remake. Let's start by talking about level design. In recent years, I've noticed a trend in what is considered to be the hallmark of great level design. People really seem to enjoy levels that loop back into themselves and offer multiple pathways to get from point A to point B, as well as surprising the player with shortcuts from one area to another. It's kind of difficult to explain what I mean, but basically it's just non-linear level design. It's difficult to pin down exactly when this style of level design popped up. It could have been the original Doom, or maybe the first 2 Metroid games, but for my money, if I had to guess what game brought this idea into the mainstream and basically made it a requirement if you want your level design to be considered good, it was probably the original Dark Souls. I know it's a huge meme at this point in these sorts of game analysis videos to bring up Dark Souls, but it's a meme for a reason. This game was stupid influential. I want to be very clear here because I can already visualize the comments I could potentially be getting about this. I'm not claiming Dark Souls invented non-linear level design in video games. I'm just saying that the particular way that a metric fuckton of modern games are handling this type of level design is very reflective of the Souls series and Bloodborne, and that's probably not a coincidence. It's honestly probably its own video topic at this point, so I'll move on, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say here. Anyway, the point of this section is Resident Evil 2 does all the things that I just said, at least at first. The police station is a really satisfying maze of hallways, locked doors, and puzzles with multiple branching pathways from one place to another. But, unfortunately, just like in the original, as you get into the sewers and the lab, this starts to break down a little bit. But I'd say the sheer level of detail and improvements put into the police station more than make up for the marginally weaker second half. The ranking system was brought back for the remake, and this style of level design makes it that much more compelling. Part of the fun is trying to figure out which route through the station is going to result in the quickest time or the least saves, or whatever combination of things is going to result in a higher rank. I once heard level design like this described as a Metroidvania map if you made it 3D by crumpling it up into a ball, and I think that nails down how to describe this game pretty well, at least for the first half. But in a horror game, your level design doesn't mean shit if the enemies trying to eat your face aren't also compelling. And boy, are the enemies in this game compelling. The zombies in Resident Evil 2 are the best zombies I've ever seen in a video game, and it's not even close. Their unpredictable movement and spooky zombie shrieks are legitimately scary. I'm a veteran of both horror movies and horror games, and I don't scare easily at all, and I felt tense squaring off against these things. I should mention that I'm not trying to act like some bad boy gamer who's too cool for scares. It's just when you've played as many of these games and seen as many of these movies as I have, you can pretty easily spot all the scares before they happen, and you get pretty used to fake people acting fake scared. Fortunately though, this game does a lot of stuff to make my real ass real scared. One time, after a night of playing through this game, I was walking through the parking garage at my work the next morning, and one of those big-ass parking garage ventilation fans kicked on, and I almost jumped through the concrete ceiling into the ionosphere. If you're susceptible to video game scares, the zombies in this game are going to ruin your life. The major factor in how scary these zombies are is this game's stupidly complicated gore system. This is a little difficult to talk about without being extremely morbid, but the short and long of it is, wherever you shoot a zombie, you'll get a bullet hole. And if you shoot them in the head, which you will, because that's the rules for zombies, you'll notice that their faces and scalps break apart in all sorts of unique and innovative ways. You can also shoot for limbs. If you take off a leg, for example, you don't really need to waste any more ammo killing the zombie because they aren't nearly as much of a threat on the floor. It's tough to really describe how detailed this whole system is, so I'm just going to show you a bunch of footage here to show you what I mean.
Son of a bitch. You asshole. Shit. They're everywhere.
Just thinking about the detail that had to go into modeling and animating these zombies is giving me fucking asthma. But what does this actually accomplish apart from overly realistic gore? Well, believe it or not, it's actually somewhat mechanically relevant. First and foremost, this solves the problem of having zombies that are basically just bullet sponges. Bullet sponge enemies are one of my least favorite things in a shooter, and it's one of the reasons gunplay in most modern games is so lame to me. Here is footage of a game with notoriously bad bullet sponges. Here is some footage of Resident Evil 2. Which one of those looked like it was more compelling? The zombies are reactive to your shots, which is nice, but more importantly, seeing a monster slowly lumbering towards you while its face gets progressively more disintegrated is just extremely unsettling. This is helped even more by the fact they used to be human, so you get a nice dose of empathy-fueled body horror. Also, Jesus Christ, listen to these things. The zombies aren't the only great move this game made. Lickers have had their role completely and totally changed. In the original Resident Evil 2, the Lickers basically just function as super zombies. They're a little faster, deal more damage, and are generally more dangerous than a zombie, but their function is identical. They attack immediately, and your only option is to either run or kill them. But in the remake, encountering one is a little bit more dynamic for a couple reasons. Obviously, you can still kill one or run, but now you have a couple other options. You'll notice that Lickers don't have eyes, and in the remake, the developers decided to make that mechanically relevant. Now Lickers are blind, and if you move quietly enough, you might be able to sneak past one without alerting it. They're also extremely sensitive to flashbang grenades because of their hearing. Now when you see a Licker, you actually consider changing your playstyle rather than handling the situation the same as you always would. And just to add a couple other side notes about enemies, the giant spiders didn't make a comeback for the remake, but they were replaced with G embryos, which makes a little bit more sense from the perspective of the Resident Evil storyline. Although I'm sure seeing these giant tarantulas in HD would have been cool. I'd mention bosses here, but I'm gonna scream about them a little bit more when I get into detail about the storyline. Right now, it's time to talk about the Second Amendment. Like most games, Resident Evil 2 heavily relies on making the bad men go away as a core mechanic. Also, like most games, Resident Evil 2 uses shoot guns and bang bangs. The most clear and obvious difference between the gunplay of the original versus the remake is that in the remake, the completely different camera allows you to actually aim in 3 dimensions accurately, rather than just pointing in a direction and shooting, or aiming your gun at a ceiling and hoping things work out. You might think that this would take away some of the horror or the suspense from the game. Giving the player too much control over where they shoot could make them feel less like a normal person trapped in a scary situation, and more like John Wick. This is more or less one of the core issues people had with Resident Evil 4, and it was a fear people had when it was originally revealed that Resident Evil 2 would use a similar over-the-shoulder camera angle. Luckily, this game takes several steps to make sure that isn't a problem. First off, there's all that shit I said earlier about enemy design. The zombies are troublingly resistant to bullets, and being able to rattle off an entire magazine of headshots doesn't really make them any less scary. On top of that, I'm fairly sure zombie health is randomized, so you don't really know how many shots it's ever going to take to kill one. And finally, you'll notice that your aiming reticle starts larger and then shrinks down after a small delay that will be longer or shorter depending on what weapon you're using. If you shoot after the reticle shrinks, your shots are more accurate and I think do a little bit more damage. This incentivizes you to wait before shooting instead of just hip firing 48 shots into the nearest zombie and all of the surrounding office furniture. Making the player try to actually stand still and take their time shooting at enemies massively increases the tension, and it's yet another way this game manages to be as intimidating as it is. Sure, if you've got the grenade launcher or the Magnum, you can wage a scorched earth campaign against the undead hordes and feel a little bit more secure about your penis size, but eventually wasting all that ammo is probably going to come back to bite you. Basically, all of the combat mechanics in this game are designed from the ground up to make sure you're still scared, even if you've been playing shoot gun games since you were 3 years old and half your neural synapses are devoted to twitch headshots. Let's take a break from game design and start talking about that story stuff I said I was going to get into earlier. I would describe the entire Resident Evil series as having bad writing, terrible acting, but still being an amazing story. This is probably going to confuse everyone, so let me explain what I mean. First and foremost, I think this is something that is 100% only achievable if your medium is a video game. If you're watching a movie, basically everything is writing and acting. I know some of you movie buffs are going to be personally offended that I'm disregarding cinematography, but my point is, if your writing and acting are bad, your movie is almost for sure going to be bad. Unless you manage to disguise your horseshit as an art house masterpiece and trick everyone into thinking that it's good, which in and of itself takes a genius, so props to you, I guess. And obviously, of course, a book is just writing, so if the writing is bad, then it's bad. But a game is something more. When you experience a game, you're an actor in the game, and you're also participating in making the story. If a game just gives the player all the pieces they need to make up their own amazing story, then everything will fall in line, even if you write like Stephanie Meyer and you paid homeless people to deliver your lines. The Resident Evil series has everything you need for a great story. It's got reluctant heroes, evil corporations, conspiracies, monsters, mad science, over-the-top villains, tragic romance plots, and even a small man who dresses like Napoleon, even though he lives in Spain and not France. All of the pieces for an amazing story are here, which is probably why the movie series is so infuriating for anyone who's a fan of the games. I would almost describe the storyline of Resident Evil as being more of a mythology than a concrete story. If you're reading old Greek myths or something, you're going to come across a lot of the same stories and the same characters, but the stories are all fluid and contradictory, so you kind of get to fill in all the blanks yourself, and that's what makes reading them so cool. The Resident Evil games are kind of the same thing. Now that we've established how I feel about the overall story arc of the series, let's zero in on the game that we're actually talking about. Resident Evil is a series that is notorious for terrible voice acting and goofy lines.
This mansion is gigantic. We could get into trouble if we get lost. We should start from the first floor, okay? And Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
This remake, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, actually has decent voice acting. With the exception of Claire, whose voice performance is exceedingly good. She's voiced by this lady. I don't know, follow her on Twitter or something. I could tell you why her performance is good, but this is a video, so here's some clips, I guess.
Looks like it leads underground. Good. We can get out of this hellhole. Hey, Marvin! Guess what? I think I found the way out! Marvin, come on. Let's get you out of here. Let's go. I won't budge. Oh. Hello? Hey. It's okay. I won't hurt you, I promise. Do you need help? Here, you can take my hand. You need help. I'm sorry, I can't understand you.
You need help.
Why?
He's right behind you.
What?
Sherry's been implanted. She can't be saved.
Are you fucking kidding me? You're her mother. Get in here!
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Are you kidding me? You were doing just fine without me, so I came along and got you all sorts of trouble.
As far as the actual plot for the game itself goes, I'm not going to go over the entire thing because that would be dumb and boring, but I am going to go over two things that I think this game could have done better in terms of the delivery of its story. Also, before I get into this, I want to stress that it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme. In this part of the video, I'm mostly just nitpicking story delivery for a goof. That being said, the first problem I have with Resident Evil 2's plot is Claire and Leon are treated a little bit too much like badass action heroes. Now, I know you can sit there like a smartass and be like, But Jacob, in Resident Evil 1, Jill killed a snake that was a big snake and not the size that a snake normally is. Isn't that like an action movie? And to that I would say yes, but the difference is Resident Evil 2 specifically is literally the only mainline game in the entire franchise where it doesn't make sense for the characters to be 80s movie heroes. In Resident Evil 0, 1, and 3, the characters involved are almost all STARS members, which is more or less the Raccoon City version of a highly trained SWAT team. Then, from Resident Evil 4 through 6, most of the characters involved are all of those same characters, but with even more years of experience fighting bioweapons and zombies. However, in Resident Evil 2, we have Leon Kennedy as a rookie cop, and Claire Redfield as like a motorcycle enthusiast, I guess. Let me ask you a question. Do you think the average motorcycle enthusiast or rookie cop would jump into a Coliseum fight pit with this thing? I didn't think so.
Whatever you do, don't stop until it's finished.
Trust me. This ends now.
The second argument I would probably get from people if anyone actually watched these videos would be, but Jacob, Leon and Claire are totally badass. Look at them in their later games. Here's a gif of Leon Kennedy roundhouse kicking a foreigner. Yes, all of that is correct, but that's like 6 years after Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 is an origin story, more so than any other game in the franchise, so it really makes no sense that Leon and Claire would be going toe-to-toe with giant alligators and mutants like it's no big deal. Again, I totally understand why the game is presented this way. I mean, from a game design perspective, what's more fun? Developing Average Person Grocery Shopping Simulator 2 Zombie Outbreak, or this? Now, to argue against myself for a second here, there is actually one section of the game that handles this problem very well. In one encounter with William, instead of fighting him directly, you can run from him and trick him into getting hit by this big shipping crate. This is a genius choice for a couple of reasons. It's far more believable than a normal person could pull this off, and it still makes the character look like a hero. If I was developing horror games, this is probably how I would think about handling most bosses. Also, yes, I know I didn't mention Resident Evil 7 back when I was talking about mainline titles in the franchise. That game is weird and I haven't played it yet. Get off my back. The next issue I have with the way the story in Resident Evil 2 is told comes from the scenario system. This is actually something that I think the original handled a little bit better. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, in Resident Evil 2, there's a scenario A and a scenario B. If you select Claire for scenario A, then you'll play as Leon in scenario B, and vice versa. Both scenarios are a little different in terms of item placement and that kind of thing, and since both Claire and Leon get access to different weapons, which makes gameplay slightly different, basically what this effectively does is makes 4 slightly different gameplay experiences. Now, the original game did a pretty good job of making sure these scenarios complemented each other and actually seemed like 2 sets of simultaneous events. Obviously, there were some contradictions. Like, for example, both characters in both scenarios are the ones that put out the helicopter fire, which obviously is a bit of a paradox, but for the most part, they meshed. The Resident Evil 2 remake throws most of that in the dumpster. I'm not going to go cinema sins on you with every single plot hole you can see between the 2 scenarios in the remake, but there is a lot of goofy shit. The biggest one is probably Mr. X getting killed by William very early in the first scenario, but being present for the entire playthrough in the second scenario. I guess maybe he regenerated, or the reason you don't see him anymore for the first scenario is because he's going after the character in the second scenario. None of this matters. What am I doing with my life? This story shit is lame. Let's cut to something radical. Hell yeah. Since we are talking about differences between the original and the remake, I might as well use that as a transition to talk about more of the differences between the original and the remake. First of all, the soundtrack of the original is, in my opinion, orders of magnitude better than the remake. Luckily, there's a mod that will let you include the original soundtrack in the remake, which I would highly recommend. Secondly, and this isn't really a matter of better or worse, but it seems like the remake places a much heavier emphasis on resource management than the original. In the original Resident Evil 2, you get a truckload of healing items and more or less enough ammo to kill every enemy you come across. The remake, however, will punish you significantly more for wasting ammo on weaker enemies. I think this is because the remake gives you much more freedom during combat, so on top of doing all the stuff I mentioned back in the section where I talked about how combat mechanics and whatnot work, incentivizing you to get around an enemy instead of directly confronting it is another way of making you feel a little bit more helpless. Because resource management is a little bit bigger of a deal in the remake, I actually felt like the remake was a little bit more difficult than the original, and I haven't even tried to play a hardcore playthrough yet. And lastly, I think that Mr. X, or Tyrant, showing up in Scenario A in the remake was a little strange. In the original, Mr. X is what made the second scenario unique and a little bit more difficult. I suppose that having him show up a little earlier for a short amount of time was a good way to give players sort of a tutorial on how he would work for later, but I still would have preferred him to be isolated to Scenario B, I think, just to preserve a little bit more of the second playthrough's uniqueness. Well, that basically covers my thoughts on the main game, but like I mentioned a couple other times in this video, that isn't all there is to Resident Evil 2. You also have 5 extra game modes. You can only see 4 here because I haven't unlocked Tofu Survivor yet because I'm a fake gamer girl. As you can see, we've got 4th Survivor and then Ghost Survivors, which collectively make up 3 other game modes. This designation is really irrelevant though, because all 5 of these game modes are essentially the same thing. You start as a character in one specific area of the map, and you need to manage all of your resources as efficiently as possible and survive getting to wherever your arbitrary level exit is. I should also point out that these are all essentially challenge modes, so they are fucking hard, and enemy placement is intentionally bullshit. Beating any one of these is meant to be a frustrating challenge, and it delivers. Personally, I think 4th Survivor is my favorite. Unlike in the Ghost Survivor mode, you can't pick up any additional items, so what you start with in your inventory is all you get. I would actually love to play a game that is just like 100 levels of a concept similar to this. You can get a ton of depth and strategy out of trying to figure out what ammo to use when, and where the most efficient spot to throw a grenade is, and which enemies should be killed versus which enemies you should run from. 4th Survivor is absolutely amazing game design. Really, this whole game is fantastic and has completely revitalized the Resident Evil franchise. You can't really go wrong with playing this, and if you're a completionist, it's going to keep you busy for a long time with all of its bonus game modes, unlockables, and ranking systems. But if you look back at the title of this video, you'll notice that I still have one last thing to talk about, and that is this. What the fuck is a video game remake supposed to be? This is kind of an important question if your goal is to revamp a game from the 90s. There has been such massive improvement in virtually every single aspect of technology since the 90s that it's analogous to making a film remake of a silent film. Most people would agree you can't just port the game, but what about stuff like the DS HD remake of Ocarina of Time? It's a lot shinier, but it doesn't really add much else to the experience. Let's take a look at the old gold standard of a video game remake, the original Resident Evil 1 remake. In terms of visuals, this remake was absolutely unprecedented. No one had ever really tried rebuilding a game from the ground up like this before. This remake is likely responsible for kicking off the slew of HD remakes we saw in later years, like the recent Crash and Spyro HD remakes, for example. So why was this the gold standard? Well, like I said before, it was built from the ground up and not just a new paint job on original assets. Secondly, it added a couple gameplay mechanics that weren't present for the original game, like the defensive weapons, for example. Other than that, though, it was a pretty faithful recreation of the experience of the original game. But now we have Resident Evil 2, which has completely raised the bar on what it means to remake a video game. Obviously, the entirely rebuilt visuals are here, but Resident Evil 2 went much farther on expanding the experience than the original Resident Evil remake. The police station is similar, but massively changed in many ways to both preserve the original feel of the game and create a totally new experience. There are secondary weapons like the grenades and knives that didn't exist in the original, new puzzles, new game modes, how bosses work was completely revamped. Basically, Capcom took Resident Evil 2, remade it, and then stacked an entire new game on top of the remake. In the wake of the effort put into this, it's going to be increasingly difficult for other developers to justify just rebuilding the same game with better looking assets. I am very excited at the concept of some classic games being remade for modern tech like this. Imagine if we got a Mario 64 remake of this caliber in the Mario Odyssey engine, for example. Alright, that's Resident Evil 2. You should buy it and have a fun time. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe. Also, you should follow me on Twitter to make sure you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.